Hey there, CJ Math students. Welcome to Notes 2.3. Today's notes are going to be confusing and tricky, so heads up, you need to show persistence. Don't quit on yourself, don't complain, show persistence. We're going to use the things we used from yesterday, same signs add keep, and different signs subtract more, as well as our understanding of absolute value. All right, so let's take a look at a problem like W. It says, when I have two negatives in a row, I'm going to read that as the opposite of negative 4 plus 10. So what's the opposite of negative 4? 4 plus 10. And what's 4 plus 10? 14. So the opposite of negative 4, that makes that positive, and that is 14. So I put a W on 14. Problem like number 3. I'm going to say 3 plus, and since this is a bracket, it's not an absolute value, it's a bracket, the opposite of negative 8. So that just becomes 3 plus 8. What's 3 plus 8? That's 11. So I put a on 11. All right, let's get to a couple of problems that are a little bit more difficult. Let's try a problem like N real quick. So it says negative 12 plus the opposite of negative 5. Well, I'm going to rewrite that as negative 12 plus 5, and this is where I have to use yesterday's material. So this is a different signs, because I have a negative and a positive. This is a different sign, subtract more. So therefore, I'm really going to subtract this, even though there's a plus sign. I'm going to say 12 minus 5, and I know that that equals 7, but it's negative 7 because I had more negatives. I had 12 negatives versus 5 positives. So negative 7, I put an N on negative 7. All right, let's do something like this. It says, what is the opposite of 4 plus negative 7? So first, I have to do the 4 plus the negative 7. And again, that's different sign, subtract more. So I'm going to say, what is the opposite of 4 plus negative 7? 4 plus negative 7, different sign, subtract, because I had a positive and a negative. So I really do 7 minus 4, which is 3, but I have more negatives. So it's the opposite of negative 3, because that's what 4 plus negative 7 is. If you don't know what I'm talking about, double check it in your calculator. Type in 4 plus negative 7. I guarantee you it gets you negative 3. Just know that the negative sign on your calculator is all the way at the bottom, right to the left of the enter sign. So, but the opposite of negative 3 is 3. So I'm going to go find 3 down at the bottom, and I'm going to put an E there. All right, let's move from perhaps this all the way down to N. What is the opposite of negative 2, right? This is almost like ST math, where it flips it once positive, once negative, once positive, right? So so take it from here. Here's negative 2. What's the opposite of negative 2? Positive 2. And then what's the opposite of that? Negative 2. So your answer here is negative 2. So you put an N on negative 2 all the way over here. All right, let's go to this column right here where we're working with absolute value. So it says 6 plus the absolute value of negative 1. We know absolute value is always the positive space, or the distance from 0. So how many spaces is negative 1 from 0? Just one space. So that just becomes 6 plus 1, and that's 7. So you don't have to worry about any crazy same signs add keep or different signs subtract more when you have those straight bars. Notice those are bars for absolute value, and those are brackets, right? Different. What is the absolute value of negative 3? We know that is just 3, plus the absolute value of 30. We just know that's 30. That gives you 33. So I'm going to put an O on 33 right at the beginning there. Okay. Now, R is tricky because inside the absolute value, you actually have a DSSM problem, right? It says, what is 4 plus negative 9? So first, you got to figure out 4 plus negative 9. Different signs subtract. So 9 minus 4. That's 5, but keep the sign you have more of. I have more negatives than I do positive. 9 negatives versus 4 positives. So that is really the absolute value of negative 5 plus 10. Then what's the absolute value of negative 5? Well, that's just 5 plus 10, which is 15. That's a tricky one. It's got multiple steps. But again, you got to show that persistence. Really go back, take a look at your notes, take a look at what we've learned, and break it down step by step for you to get it. Okay? I'm going to scoot down here to the second section of the puzzle, right? So that was the first section. Second section is a little bit like the first one, but then also has some substitution. So the first one says, what is the opposite of the absolute value of negative 11 plus 6? Well, first you got to take the absolute value of negative 11 plus 6, which is DSSM. Different sign, subtract more. So negative 11 plus 6 is really subtract 11 minus 6, which is 5, but I have more negatives, so negative 5. So what is the opposite of the absolute value of negative 5. And the absolute value of negative 5 is 5. Now, now we can take the opposite of that, which is just negative 5, right? So the absolute value of negative 5 is positive 5. And then what's the opposite of positive 5? Just negative 5. So negative 5 is your answer there, meaning you're going to put an I on negative 5. Let's go this one again. DSSM here, 10 plus negative 4, different signs, subtract more. 10 minus 4 is 6. I have more positives this time, so finally I have a positive answer. So it's the opposite of the absolute value of positive 6. Again, positive 6 was because 10 minus 4, because different signs, positive and negative. I subtract them, keep the sign I have more if I have more positives. Absolute value of 6 is just 6. And what is the opposite of a positive 6? A negative 6, right? So I put a O on negative 6 right there. All right. E is tricky because when you have a number right next to an absolute value, that actually means multiplication. So really you want 3 times the absolute value of negative 2, which we know as 2. So I'll just put that in parentheses. That's not 32, but 3 times 2 plus, what is the absolute value of negative 3? 3. Now order of operations says you got to multiply first. So 3 times 2 is 6. 6 plus 3. Sorry, computer keeps trashing, so I had to restart it. So you're going to find 9, and you're going to put an E on it. All right, so a long one here. First, big time persistence here. Negative 9 plus 13, that's DSSM. So really that's 13 minus 9, which is 4. I had more positives, so that becomes 5 times the absolute value of 4 plus negative 1. The absolute value of 4 is just 4, so there's 5 times 4. Again, a number next to a parentheses means times, plus negative 1. So really 20, because we got to multiply first before we add or subtract, plus negative 1. And then this in itself, all the way at the end, is also a DSSM problem. So 20 plus negative 1 is 19. So on 19, we find our answer of R. I know this is confusing stuff. I'm really pushing your thinking on this, guys. And my computer keeps changing. But just like I'm showing persistence, I'm going to ask you to show some persistence as well. All right, problem E, super tough. On the inside, we got 2 times the absolute value of negative 7 plus negative 6. And at the end, I'm going to take the opposite of that. So let's just do the brackets first. 2 times the absolute value of negative 7. Well, the absolute value of negative 7 is 7. So 2 times 7 plus negative 6. That's still in brackets. What's 2 times 7? Well, that's 14. 14 plus negative 6, that's still in brackets. And this itself is a DSSM problem. What is 14 plus negative 6? 14 really minus 6. Again, you could use a calculator if you want. 14 plus, again, the negative sign right next to the enter sign. Negative 6 tells you it's positive 8. So then the opposite of positive 8 gives you your answer of negative 8. Whew, whole bunch of steps, but you can do it. You can show that persistence and fight through. All right. The next problems, I wish I'd tell you they get a little bit easier. They don't, but that's all right. We're going to buck up. We're going to show persistence. So we got the opposite of x. So here's how we do this. First, let's plug in x. Here's x, right? So x is negative 3, but we'll put that in parentheses because we want the opposite of negative 3. That negative right there is not part of that x. It's the opposite of that. X itself is negative 3. So what is the opposite of negative 3? It's positive 3. So we find 3, we put down an O. What is the opposite of y? And y is 1. So what is the opposite of 1? Just the opposite of 1 is just negative 1, right? So we find negative 1 and we put down an A. What is the opposite of what x is? And I'll put it in parentheses. X is negative 7. So what is the opposite of negative 7 plus 5? So the opposite of negative 7 is 7, because the opposite of a negative is a positive. 7 plus 5 is 12, right? So I find 12, and I put down a y there. And last one I'm going to do here. Oh boy, get ready. Ready? What is the opposite of A? And A, by the way, is a negative 20. So look how this goes. Ready? A negative, followed by parentheses, followed by a negative, followed by another parentheses. Now I'm going to plug in my negative 20, close it up twice. So what is I got a negative 20. What's the opposite of that? Positive 20. And what's the opposite of that? negative 20. A whole bunch of stuff to keep track of. But you can do it. You can show persistence, okay? All right, final column. I know I'm a 10-minute video here. Again, it's the same thing plugging in, but this time we're dealing with absolute value. So we've got what is the opposite of the absolute value of 7? So it's like, what is the absolute value of like negative 7, right? And that's just 7. So n goes on 7. And let's jump maybe to a harder one. What is the opposite of w if w is a negative 10? So the opposite of a negative 10. So here's negative 10. The opposite of that is 10. So then what is the opposite of the absolute value of 10? The absolute value of 10 is 10. So what is the opposite of that? Negative 10. Whew! A lot to keep track of, but you can do it. All right. I'm going to leave some of these for you. They are challenging. Your homework is not this hard. Don't worry. But do your best on them. Show persistence. Don't complain. Complaining does no good to help you out and solve this, right?